Okay, it's 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started with the modern version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'll give you just a short introduction of myself for this presentation. I'm not sure if either of you or the people on Zoom have been to my presentations before, but I'm Rocky Roland. I'm a retired colonel from the US Air Force, a pilot. Spent about 27 years in the Air Force. Lived all over the world, taught at the Naval War College for 1 3-year period and was a defense attaché in Mongolia and the Air Force attaché in Beijing for 3 years. I give a lot of travel presentations here at ALL, and I also kind of branch out and do some more esoteric versions. And this is one this evening on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So we'll go ahead and start that program now. Ron, next slide, please. Many of you probably recognize this pyramid, very common in psychology circles and psychology today, the Maslow's hierarchy of need. Maslow actually came up with this theory in 1943 and then published his theory of motivation in 1947 after World War II. And it was his mindset in studying people's reactions to the war and coming out of the war that led to him developing this theory of what motivates people to behave the way they do. Of course, his first attempt at this hierarchy was not in a pyramid. And over the course of the years, he didn't actually promote that shape at all. Next slide, Ron. So this is a little more detailed version of the hierarchy of needs. Once again, the little note there is, as far as Maslow was concerned, he never did visualize this as a pyramid for the hierarchy. A new word for this presentation, one most of you probably have not heard of, called prepotency at the top of the slide there. And what that essentially means, and this was actually the main point of Maslow's theory, was that there had to be a satisfaction of each of the lower levels of needs before one could transition to the next level up, the next higher level. That's hence the term prepotency, which means satisfy the lower one first, then you can move on to the next level as you go. We'll talk a little bit about each one of these levels as we go along, starting at the bottom, which are the most basic needs. Those are the physiological needs, and we'll get into those, each one of these in more detail. Then safety and security, love and belonging, esteem and self-esteem. And then one at the top there, which I never did understand very well myself, is self-actualization. And we'll go into that in a little more detail when we get to the more modern version of Maslow's theory. Next slide, please, Ron. Starting at the bottom of the pyramid with the purple thing there is a physiological, but Maslow has some interesting concepts or ideas about his hierarchy or his theory of it. One of them was that these were rational decisions that people would make rather than instinctual or evolutionary type of reactions to a situation. So he actually believed that people would think about these and be motivated to act about their needs and requirements at each one of the levels. He was a big proponent of the positivism there, which is another word that I kind of misinterpreted when I saw it. It doesn't mean that he was very positive and optimistic. It means that Maslow was very much interested in academic proof by experiment and design of his theory, and not just in the concept itself. So he wanted to actually see proof and fact by experiments that his theory was in fact true. He also, as part of it, assumed that his theory would apply to other primates, and he did a lot of studies in the areas with animals to determine if, in fact, these same behavioral rules seem to apply among primates. And then the one thing that is noticeable as we go through this, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to the most modern versions, is the fact that group dynamics are not integrated into this theory. This is an individual theory that mostly applies to a single person reaction and motivation and does not include group behavior. And it's important to note here that individual needs cannot be satisfied by an individual alone. Especially in the modern society, there's no way that any one individual can raise his own food, get his own water, build his own shelter, provide his own security or her own security, and accomplish essentially any of these items that are in the structure as we go up the hierarchy of needs. So from the very beginning, we have to have some kind of group dynamic and interactions if people are to satisfy those needs and even be able to stay alive, which are the most basic needs. In this diagram, there's no real place where happiness is ever discussed or placed within this framework. More than likely, it would go at the top in the self-actualization area, but strangely enough, Maslow nor many of the other psychologists do not address happiness in terms of motivation. One thing we'll notice, and again, we're going to come back kind of strongly on this point when we get to the most current version of Maslow's theory as it applies to modern times, and that's communication. And the first two levels here, the basic biological needs, safety and security, communications is not a primary player in that, although it is necessary to a certain degree. But once you reach the third level, where we talk love and belonging, group formation, and we start to get feedback and esteem one level up, then communication becomes paramount. And so these things are now not self-noticed within the individual, but they do require feedback and communication from others to satisfy their needs. And finally, at the bottom, and we, again, as we go along and get more and more modern interpretations of Maslow's hierarchy, we find that procreation and parenting now have earned a place at the very top of the pyramid from modern psychologists. Next slide, please. Now, here we're going to start at the very bottom of the pyramid, physiological needs or biological needs. And these are the basic things that keep you alive: breathing, eating, water, food, things of that nature. These are also, these bottom two levels, the physiological and the safety, are termed deficiency needs, which means you don't have any and you really need it even to survive. And so they're much more critical to an individual person than those needs as we move up higher in the pyramid and start discussing these things. Economic stability fits in many people's ideas in this level, or for sure in a combination of this level and level 2, which is the safety and security needs. There has to be some level of economic stability in order for those needs to be satisfied. And then finally, another new word for a lot of people, homeostasis. Homeostasis essentially means that you've achieved kind of a steady state in your life where things are not very chaotic. You're going along, it's predictable. You don't have a day-to-day worry about food and shelter and security, and you can concentrate on other things, even though there may be some subsurface turbulence with individual acts and individual events in your life. They don't rise to the level where they disrupt your life and your level. And so that's what the people are searching for, is this homeostasis in their lives. Next slide, please. Safety needs are in many ways self-explanatory. There's a pretty good list of them here. Safety in your own home, in your surroundings, and one we'll talk about more once again as we get into what seems to be happening in modern society and modern times, and that's the nature of cultural homogeneity. And that's a term, again, that may not be very familiar. What that really means is people like to be associated with people that believe the same things they do. It's what a lot of people term PLUs, or people like us. So you like to be organized or associate with people who enjoy the same type of recreational activities. They work in the same kind of a job. You have an ability to communicate with them. That's cultural homogeneity, and it can also include things like religion and politics. And so that's what kind of leads to association with groups in this level. Law and order, some people's law and order is other people's oppression. And that's the what side of the black or white cow are you on? Is the cow white or is the cow black? Well, in some cases, it depends on which side of the cow you're on. And so that's an interesting long-term discussion sometimes on how does this apply in culture. Everyone is looking for stability. They want to get out of chaos and turbulence. And so people tend to be motivated with longer term solutions to their problems that'll provide stability rather than taking a high risk for an immediate higher gain. And then finally, in this particular category, we have freedom from fear. Many of us have gone past that. That's been now is below our homeostasis level. And we no longer on a daily or even often level have a sense of fear. But as we'll talk later on, there seems to be some resurgence of that now with current social situations. Next run, please. Now we're starting to get, this is where we said communication starts to become paramount in this stage. This is love and belonging. This has everything to do with interpersonal relationships. And this is one-on-one and also enjoying group formations, family, friends, and then we talked again about PLUs, people like us. And that's your cultural homogeneity, where once again, you try to form those associations where people support the views or you support their views. And there isn't a lot of conflict within the group. One thing that's essential in these groups and between individual relationships is that there has to be an established level of trust. If you don't have that trust, then you have anxiety that develops because you don't have that surety of what's going to happen in any given situation. And it starts to take up a major part of your concern and your activities in assuring that those actions are stable and trustworthy. I gave a presentation a few weeks ago about terrorism, and one of the keys to forming terrorist groups is that many people who are a little bit isolated or feel that they're isolated are searching very strongly to find a group to join with where they feel part of the group, they get that strong feeling of camaraderie, and they can get a sense of acceptance. And that's becoming even more and more a motivating factor today, as we do get more and more groups that feel, for whatever reason, that they are isolated, so they tend to band together. And then finally, a very important part at this level is no longer can you be self-centered for your own safety, your own biological needs. Now there has to be a sense of giving and receiving. So you can't form relationships one-sided. There has to be a sense of giving back. Next slide, please. Esteem now is where we start to see the individual have a sense of self or a sense of being. There's the self-esteem, the first part of that, dignity, a sense of achievement. Task mastery and independence kind of go together. What we have there is all individuals feel a sense of accomplishment, feel like their life is getting better when they are successful in completing tasks they've either been assigned or they've chosen to take on for themselves. So mastering a task is something that all of us, that motivates all of us. And then the second half of esteem is feedback or communication that we get from others, where other people provide us with a good feeling by complimenting us on our performance, on our task completion, on the job we're doing, or whatever. We also notice in many organizations, it's very important to offer public recognition. That is a very strong motivator for people who can see that on the horizon as an outcome of joining a group or performing a task. Rank or status, there's probably not an organization in the world that doesn't have some kind of a rank or hierarchical structure where people get increased responsibility and increased recognition by assuming a higher rank or position in the structure. And all of those things then contribute to that individual's prestige within the group and then within the community. Next, please, Ron. And then finally at the top, as I said, I was never sure when I studied this psychology in college what self-actualization really meant, and I'm not really sure I have a handle on it again at this stage. The most common definition is that of an individual fulfilling their full potential. And once again, that assessment of full potential is made by the individual themselves, not by any outside forces or outside individuals. So this requires the individual to kind of have set internal goals that they then can achieve to reach actualization. It's a function of personal growth, both mental and physical, as people go along. They start at this level. Since you've had to reach this level, you have to a certain degree, satisfied your economic needs, your security needs, your physiological needs, food and drink. And so now you can concentrate on other things. And at this level, people start to concentrate on adventure and travel and learning, where they try to go to seek experiences rather than things. And also at this level, we find there's a much higher incidence of people searching their own morality through self-examination to determine what kind of a person they really think they are. And also we see them looking around and making those kind of critiques and criticisms and assessments for the people around them. So they become much more concerned about morality and ethics at this stage. And then finally, at this stage, this is where we see the emergence and the blossoming of creativity. People have their lower level needs met. They have the time, the energy, and the resources. And so they put their willpower and their brain power into changing things. And creativity can be in art, in science, in woodworking, in literature, whatever a person puts their mind to where they think that they can make a difference in the world. Next, Ron, please. Now, this is an expanded view. This view comes from about the 1990s, so almost 50 years after Maslow's hierarchy was first envisioned as a pyramid by others and not by him. They being groups of behavioral psychologists, have now expanded that original 5-level pyramid to look something like this. And Ron, I'm going to step over here for just a minute to the screen and point out there's 3 basic differences between this presentation and the first one that we talked about, and we're going to go into those in just a little bit more detail here in just a second, but I'll point them out. Of course, you can see these 4 levels at the bottom are pretty much identical to those. Now, there's some slight name changes and maybe addition of a word or two, and that's any new person always tweaks the definition or the verbiage in order to fit their idea. But we see right here and here, the blue and the purple, we see 2 brand new areas in that. And what this is essentially, and this is kind of my assessment, and we'll talk about it, is they took part of self-actualization here, and they took part of the esteem needs here, and they shredded them out and made them more definitive and more precise, and came up with these 2 new areas, which are cognitive needs and aesthetic needs. And now, Ron, I'll go back over and we'll talk more about each one of those in detail. Okay, next slide, please, Ron. Now, cognitive needs are pretty much self-explanatory from the term. They have to do with learning. These are the first of the new level, totally new by the more modern psychologists, of what they call the being needs. And this is a growth need as opposed to a deficiency need. And what that means is deficiency needs are, as we saw at the bottom, by food, water, shelter, safety. Those are things you do not have, but you must have. And so you have to gather things in and put them into your pile or into your box in order to satisfy that need. And it's a must-have scenario. You don't have them, and if you don't got them, you're not going to survive or you're not going to be safe. So those are a little bit different. These now are growth needs. And what those are needs that you desire. They're not necessarily something that are absolutely necessary for you to survive or live, but that you see them as something that you need in order to be able to grow and become a bigger person or a better person. So those are the growth needs. And this is kind of like the more you have, the more you want. And that's very typical of knowledge. Also, people will say with money, often you'll see that said, but in this case, it has to do with knowledge, learning, excuse me, and information. So the more of that you have, your knowledge becomes broader, the more you want to know, the more details you want to have. And this kind of goes with these 3 words here, to explore. And that's the travel part. We saw that they've kind of pulled out of self-actualization before for adventure and exploration and travel. That's now this new word, explore, shows up here. And then learning theory, if you're have ever studied that or a teacher, then you know there's a very distinct definition difference between to know something and to understand something. A very much higher level of knowledge is required for understanding a much broader knowledge, and there's quite a level difference and time period usually associated with that to go from one level to another one. Something we're going to see a little later on when we talk about the impact of modern society and Maslow's needs on that are something called a worldview. And a lot of people have never heard this term before, but it's a very common in very many different kinds of literature and sciences. And worldview essentially means that a person's understanding and knowledge can only be based on their own personal history and the things they know and the things they learned. So what is inside each individual person's head determines their worldview and therefore how they see and react to the world around them, which is then usually totally different than any other individual's, because each individual's worldview and set of knowledge and understanding is different. That's worldview. We talk about that. And another thing, and this is one of Maslow's almost direct quotes in this particular newly shredded out need called cognitive need, is he believed that humans chase knowledge. They want to know more all the time. Once they have satisfied their needs for safety, shelter, and sustenance, then they are immediately off chasing knowledge and wanting to learn. Next run, please. And then this is the next level up. Once again, this has taken many of its subsets from the self-actualization block and brought them down into this one to give more detail and more depth to this definition, and also some from Esteem and bottom. And some of these you're going to see kind of seem to fit a little bit in the cognitive area too. One of the things that's interesting, and this is a word that I was kind of surprised to see in this category that goes into aesthetic, is symmetry. And this is actually a very well proven, I guess, fact, you would say, that humans all over the world extremely highly value symmetry. And that has to do with everything from art to facial structure to eye separation. Individuals determine, individual cultures and things determine beauty almost all the time based on a certain sense of symmetry. And that has to do both in human beauty and architectural beauty and visual beauty of art products. And so that beauty then transfers over in architecture, art, nature, human. And finally, one last thing that popped up here in this category now that's never been mentioned before is rest and relaxation. And that becomes a real need at this level, because once you satisfy these lower needs, and they don't just take care of themselves there once you do it, much of your energy, even though it's subconsciously and you're not worried about it, your day-to-day activities, a lot of that is spent to make sure that you maintain that homeostasis and that your economic stability is met. And then when you start overextending yourself doing some of these other things, there is a requirement or a sense that you have to step back, get some rest and relaxation and regeneration, or you will not be able to continue at the pace you're going. So that's a new concept that people now sense that, and it becomes a motivator. Next, please. A Venn diagram. Every good presentation has to have a Venn diagram. So we have one here, and it's kind of gives us a different perspective, a different idea of how these hierarchical categories may fit together. This is not in a vertical presentation, but horizontal, two-dimensional. And Ron, I'm going to go over there again if you want to follow me for just a minute. And we'll go on over here to the diagram for just a second. And I'm going to stay over here for a couple of slides, Ron. So we'll just stay here. But what you see here is many of these items are strictly right out of the hierarchy of needs definitions. But in the outside, we see that there's some new labels that have been added for the spirit and the mind and the body. And so these are more modern psychologists' takes on how the whole wellness and being of an individual can possibly fit together and still correspond to the hierarchy that Maslow came up with in his motivational theory. So we have physical needs, which are very large, the need to know and esteem. Now you can see the need to know, which is what the modern ones now put in the cognitive area, and spiritual needs, which we've never seen broken out before in any of these categories, but now in this diagram, getting a very large piece of the pie, so to speak, to go together and be the whole person. And then in the center where all of these overlap and indicating that you actually have to have this amount of overlap between each of these things is the self-actualization. Next one, please, Ron. This is probably my favorite drawing about prepotency. And this has to do, if we remember back to that slide, that you need to satisfy the lowest level needs first before you go on to the next level and start satisfying those needs. But nowhere does it ever talk in any of Maslow's works whether 50% is good enough, 60%, 70%, what percentage do you have to have before you go on and start working on the next level? Well, this kind of tells you an idea, gives you an idea how that might work, although it doesn't have specific percentages. And down in the bottom here, again, the words are not exactly the same that Maslow used, but they're very much similar ideas and concepts. We've got the blue, survival. We've got the green for safety, the social connections, love and belonging, respect, which is esteem, and then self-actualization. So you see in the left side of this diagram, the beginning of development of the person, that the highest requirements and all of the activity, nearly all of the activity that a person has in their life is focused on establishing those basic survival needs. And it's only after they spend an X length of time and get those satisfied that their safety needs pass that as far as their priority. But they had to start way back here considering the safety needs from the very beginning. It wasn't zero. They didn't start at zero. They started with that level of physiological needs, but at the same time, they already had safety and security needs that were taking part of their emphasis and time and their motivation. And then the need for that grows at a much faster rate. This one stays the same because you need X amount of air, X amount of water. And that doesn't rise and fall, and it doesn't continually increase. It doesn't have a positive slope. Safety has a positive slope for quite a period of time here because it starts back close to zero, goes up. And then once you reach a point, the amount of energy and the amount of the motivational time you have to speak goes down. And so does the security. They never go to zero, but think of this as the amount or percentage of energy you're expending to satisfy that need. Well, here it's a very high amount of energy, and here it's a very low amount of energy that you're spending to satisfy that need. And the same thing with safety and security. It's now gone down to things, and this has now taken over priority, and you're spending more time to satisfy it. You reach it, plateau out, and now it goes down, and then now your self-actualization and things takes over, and it requires, or not the self-actualization, but the respect and things goes over. And now self-actualization actually starts where? Well, way back here. But the amount of energy you're spending on it is small because you still have high requirements in these. But as these come down, it frees up time. And so this starts to go up as far as your priority, your motivation. And it's a very high slope once you have these things all together. Satisfied, that slope now becomes very high. And you start spending more and more and more and more and more of your time on the good life. Okay? So I like how this depicts the interaction of all of these various levels. Nothing starts from zero, nothing ever goes back to zero, but it's essentially a way to visualize your emphasis and the amount of time you spend and energy in trying to establish them. Okay, Ron, I'm going to go back over to the podium. All right, next slide, please, Ron. Now, this slide, I'm hoping you can read. It's fairly clear. Again, none of these slides are my slides, but I borrowed them from people who have spent time thinking about this. And to my estimation, this is, and many of modern psychologists think this is a far better representation of Maslow's hierarchy than the pyramid. And this representation is a ladder. And the reason that, that these psychologists and I myself like this is it shows that you have hands and feet on 4 different levels all at the same time. But in order to move up to a higher level, you have to get your feet on that first level first. It has to be very strong. And so your physiological needs and your safety needs are the basis, and you've got both feet on those now. You got one foot first and then the other foot, and now you're stable and you have a good solid place to stand and a good basis for your life. And then you can start reaching for those next levels. So now you have belongingness, love. Belongingness and love are the same kinds of activities, and you want to get there and stay there. And so in order to do that, you probably want to stand on that. And so that's why this shows there's really not a foot on that. You're going to step up to that on thing. Once you have those slopes going down for safety and security, then you can make another step up because now you're confident of your place on the ladder. Meanwhile, you still got both hands up in front of you, and you're actually pulling yourself up. And this is part of the motivation of the cognitive and the aesthetic as part of self-actualization is you are now reaching for new things because you want them. These are the desire levels of motivation. Okay, next Ron. This is within the last 10 years, a new group of psychologists have come up with this pyramidal version of hierarchy of needs, which also gives you a little bit different perspective on how these might fit together. Now, one thing here, and there's 2 that stick out, 3 actually that stick out, totally different. Those are the top 3 levels. Totally different, nothing similar at all with Maslow's needs. They jump from esteem right to mate acquisition, which we find to be an interesting term. We talked about earlier, how in the world, who would ever talk to their mate and say, oh, well, I'm glad I acquired you. I don't think that would go over very well. So that's obviously an academic term that they use to try to give some kind of representation to that. And then mate retention, that now takes a lot of your energy and a lot of your motivational structure. And then finally, these modern psychologists have placed parenting instead of self-actualization. And so the idea there is, instead of working on yourself to be the best person you can be, you are trying to work on your children to be the best people they can be. And that's the difference in the focus there. They think that truly self-actualized people, people that have reached the highest level, shift their concern to their children, and they spend their energy and their motivation trying to make sure their children reach the highest level, and they lose some of that motivation for themselves. Next, Ron, please. This is another, I've used this chart in various other presentations I've given in the past, and I think it's really helpful in identifying what's gone on in society and what's going on now as we try to understand how people behave and what causes their belief structure and how they react day to day. And if we start at the far left part of this screen, we see the traditionalists, and those are the people before the Second World War. And there's a few of those around. Here we all have friends or neighbors or grandparents or great-grandparents, and their values, structure, and the things that they consider necessary are much different in many cases than people who were born a few years later. Many of us, me and a lot of my friends, are boomers. We're in the 1946 to 1964 category. A lot of things going on in there. It's got a whole list of events you can read that kind of categorizes what we've lived through. The reason those events are on there is to give you an idea of what that group of individuals' worldview is, because those events are what shaped their lives, what they saw, what they lived through, and those particular events helped shape their worldview. And then at the bottom of each one of these categories, we see things starting to take shape that do probably influence today's atmosphere and motivation more than anything else. And the really first evidence of this digital revolution comes with the boomers, and that's because during our lifetimes was the evolution and the start of the personal computer. And so that opened up communications, research, knowledge to individuals far more than was ever available in the past. Now the Gen X people, that's 65 to 76, in their list of events that happened in their lifetime, similar kinds of things, very big life events that influenced their worldview, but now probably the biggest influence that changed them and the rest of our lives in that period of time was the coming of the mobile phone and its ascension into a place in everybody's home and hand, where mobile phones now just about everyone seems to have one. And so therefore that now makes information and knowledge even more readily available, but as we're finding out, it also makes disinformation more readily available. And so we have communication problems start to develop by an instrument that was originally designed to make communication better. So we see that happening with the mobile phone. Millennials, 1977 to 97, many of those people have never known life without digital phones and digital equipment. They have no idea about manual operation of anything. And so their life, their worldview is totally different than the boomers, and much, much more different than Gen X and people before. So what happens here at the bottom of that, we see that now social limit, Google and Facebook and TikTok and all of these new sites, YouTube, those particular things start to rule their knowledge and their worldview. So they get their information nearly 100% from those sources. And finally, after 97, we have Jim 2020. Those people for sure have never lived outside a digital environment. Many of them may not even recognize books and things. I mean, I'm sure they do, but it's not too facetious to say that. They have very high expectations. They've been provided a good life by their parents. They never really, many of them had to worry about the physiological needs and the safety needs because they were supplied to them from the very beginning. And so they now are into social apps, social games, and in addition to their cell phones, they have tablets, and they don't communicate any other way than through their cell phones and through their tablets. And so that is a driving factor in what is influencing our culture today. Next, please. I think this is kind of a cute slide here. This is a slide that says, okay, Gen 2020, this is what their hierarchy of needs looks like. And the number one thing they need are batteries. They need battery life. There's no other thing more important to them than having battery life or having a device that works. And then immediately above that is the word Wi-Fi, but that really means connectivity. It's Wi-Fi is the right word in this case, but it really means connectivity. And it can be through your phone, through your tablet, however you can connect to the world. That's more important than food, water, shelter, and safety to the Gen 2020. Next slide. And this is a little different version of Maslow's hierarchy, pyramidal structure, where we see the icons on each level representing which devices, which software functions, which apps are applicable and support each of the levels. So we've got physiological needs at the bottom, safety. And as you reach toward the top, we've got Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And then at the top, we have LinkedIn and YouTube for by the time the 2020s finally reach a stage where they have to get a job, then they finally transition to more of a realistic site like LinkedIn instead of TikTok. So pretty good representation of how the younger generation survives. Next run, please. And this is how businesses today market using Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And they truly do this. They actually sit down, look at their product, look at the hierarchy of needs. This gives them the demographics that they want to try to hit and market to. And then they come up with either products or slogans or advertising campaigns in order to reach that particular demographic. Next run, please. Now, this is where we get to the point where, okay, what's happening today out there? Because now we've got this generational structure. We've got the creation of instant information and instant disinformation rapidly flowing everywhere. We've got trust now, if we remember that back from the Esteem level, trust is faltering at this time. Trust in sources, trust in information, trust in social structures, trust in governmental structures. Trust itself is kind of on the ropes. We see there the competition now. If we remember back to the Esteem level, that there's self-esteem and then there's esteem that's conveyed upon you by other people. Well, we've seen a really, really sharp decline in the beneficial esteem imported onto people. We see much, much more competition, much more aggression, and much more social representation against people rather than raising them up. And so this has now started to influence our esteem, and it's started to influence our safety. And so even though none of us have really probably worried about the physiological and safety needs for years, now once in a while we start to get a twinge that those things may be in a little bit of danger. And that's what that means is that we started to lose some of the trust we have in those organizations and in the information, and that's being fed by the generational differences and the importance, in other words, the hierarchy of needs that people put on different things now than they did 20 years ago. This information and different information certainly is influencing what we know and what we understand. I know many, many people now are just not sure what they do know and understand about a lot of many current situations because it's so difficult to sort through the sources. our sense of community has become fragmented, and that's also in the third level. When we start to develop groups, we start to build upon each other, and that started to break down and become fragmented. Empathy is fading, and what that means is we used to be able to empathize or feel like we could understand what other people were going through. That whole idea is losing merit. Empathy has been taken over by aggression. And so now we see a much higher level of aggression, a much lower level of empathy, which means satisfying your esteem needs and your belonging needs gets to be harder and harder and harder, and they start to break down and fragment where they already existed. The COVID pandemic has been devastating to all of these levels of satisfaction of needs. And it has just fractured many organizations and structures that were in place. It's isolated many people and given them a sense of isolation. And so when they have that sense of isolation, they tend to glom on to information and groups and people where they can get any kind of a sense of feedback that satisfies their own beliefs. And so we find groups becoming more and more radicalized because they become isolated and insulated in their own environment. And finally, this complex hierarchy of good preconditions. Think of that as the bottom two levels of the ladder over there. This level of structure has been in existence and we haven't had to worry about it, and it's been solid as a rock for years. And suddenly we start to see gaps in that structure. We start to see support systems not operating like they should or even failing. We start to see businesses failing where we haven't seen that in years. And so it's a reduction in trust, and it's a reduction in our ability to see, to have an optimistic future. Next, Ron, please. So here's some things to take away from the translation of the hierarchy of needs as Maslow envisioned them starting in 1943, and how they've morphed all through the years to get to that point of what we've talked about with the interlocking waves, and now the generational structure overlaid over the top of that, causing some problems in the current environment. And so this study of motivation, we have to remember that what Maslow was trying to do is figure out why people behave the way they do. Well, we kind of had a pretty good idea on that, but now we don't understand that so very much. We are seeing a lot of unpredictable events, and we're seeing a lot of people who are behaving in unpredictable manners that we could have never imagined 10 years ago, what various people are doing. And so this has become a total shakeup of our confidence in that particular part of the pyramid. Physiological motives are still paramount. They will always be paramount to maintain the homeostasis. But what we have found is, in the previous slide, is some of those things we start to see cracks in the foundation. We start to see some of our most trusted structures not looking near as strong as they once did. And we start to see now people taking their attention away from esteem and from self-actualization and from parenting, and having to concentrate again on stability and safety and physiological needs that they haven't had to do for several years. The habits are our strongly learned behaviors, and they become our motives. Those are things we do over and over again. In many cases, they become so structured that we don't even think about them. They're just almost subliminal. We go ahead and do them. These are our self-protection mechanisms. And the place we're finding ourselves in now is sometimes we're reevaluating that. Some of those habits of how we've always done things are being shaken, and we have to look at them again, and we're not used to that. Our cognitive motives, learning and understanding, our need to know, they come from our personal understanding, our worldview, and what's happening there now is that if you remember the generational chart, is we have quite the disparity in worldviews. So how each one of those generational groups view what's going on in the world are totally different. And that causes confusion and breakdown in the community. So it's an interesting concept. One of the things that Maslow really emphasized was that people are much more likely to be motivated by something where they think they are going to be successful. If they look out in front of them and there's a risk-reward step to be taken to either satisfy one of their current needs or get to a new level, if their sense of being able, right, or being able to do it or being successful is good, they'll do it and make the leap. Well, that confidence level has now been shaken in a lot of cases. So we see a lot of people maintaining a level of place and no longer reaching or doing for these higher levels because it's risky and they've lost that risk-reward confidence. Next, Ron, please. This one at the top, the social respect, acknowledgement, feedback, and quote, likes is a powerful, well, no one knows that better than Facebook. They've been massively successful in manipulating feedback. And that's through comments and icons and likes. And so this has now become a real issue in our society where people are getting this feedback from these social mechanisms and not from people. And so it's causing all kinds of distrust and disloyalty and fueling aggression and separation more than we've ever had, because it's kind of removed the personal touch and it's gone to impersonal through those social media. This aggression and scapegoating are being rationalized. In other words, it's okay to be aggressive and it's okay to put other people down or to have no empathy because they don't deserve it. They're in the wrong. And we've gotten a lot of social structures now where there's a distinct categorizing of people as right or wrong. And we as a society and structure haven't had that before. So it's another thing we find ourselves doing. And what that is that's a symptom of displaced stress. People are now under stress for their basic needs where they haven't been, and they become isolated by the pandemic, which they haven't been. These two functions are causing stress in individuals and they're acting out because of that. This group identification, we've talked about it twice. It has to do with this now sense of isolation that we have. People need to find themselves identified with a group. They need that camaraderie. But it's in its extreme, it can lead to violent and vicious behavior. And we've seen that in the not too recent past, how that's come to pass, where these groups, where the people in the groups would never do those things individually. Now we see it happening. And that's what happens in this scenario. Now, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, remember we talked about prepotency. They are prepotent. But remember, the curly wave chart is that none of those things act independently. They're all moving below the surface, and they're all somewhat interactive in each other, kind of like the ladder, where you have to have both feet and both arms in play at the time. However, kind of to wrap the whole thing up that we talked about tonight, this hierarchy of needs, whether you think of it, you prefer to use the ladder or you prefer to use the pyramid in your mind to visualize the structure of how people decide to do what they're going to do, is kind of helpful for us all of us in our society, in our areas, to understand why people are doing what they're doing and why they've changed what they're doing and what they've been doing in the past. So it also helps us for ourselves if we feel a little bit of this uncomfortableness, to find a place or a way to go forward for ourselves to get back on track and get moving up the ladder again. Okay, next slide, Ron. And that pretty much wraps it up for Maslow and what we see happening in current times. Any questions or comments or additions, deletions, subtractions? Okay, that's it. Guy lied. Oh, whoa, okay. Yes, sir. Yeah. It's I think it's a scary time out there. And a lot of it is because things are so unpredictable. And homeostasis, one of the big factors of homeostasis is predictability. So in those cases, we've managed to get ourselves into a state of predictability. Now all of us, we look around and we have a hard time predicting what's going to happen next. It just doesn't make sense sometimes. But there's no cause and effect type of things. And also we have to remember which generational group we're in. So our thought processes and the way that we consider facts and groups and things is totally different. A totally different way of approaching a problem and thinking about it than the younger groups, all of the younger groups. And so that's the most difficult thing all of us have, and they have too. They don't understand us. They don't get it. They don't get why we do what we do. And because they can't identify with it. It's not in their worldview. So the only thing that can overcome that is communication. It's the only thing. The only thing that can overcome any of that is communication. The problem we have now is communication has become discrete. In other words, this group of communication supports this group and their view and this group, and we don't have any communication that goes back and forth between those. There's no flow of information back and forth between those groups and those centers and those things. And that's what's becoming more and more concerning as you go along, is that now you have people have no idea because they have one set of facts, which are not the facts. And then another group has a different set of facts, which are not the facts. And they build their entire mindset based on that, and they don't talk to each other. It's like looking at Congress, come on. That's the stupidest thing you can ever imagine in a country like ours, that you can't talk to the other person. I mean, talk to them. So, yes.
And even within family.
Oh, sure. It's torn some families apart.
Yeah.
Really has. I mean, it's very sad. Maslow's hierarchy of needs does not explain anything. It's not an explainer, but it helps you understand what those people are doing and why they're doing it. But we see in that level, and way back to fourth or fifth slide, is that you can't get back up past level three without communication. You can't do it. And so that's the dilemma we find ourselves, not just us, that's everywhere in the world. We find ourselves in now is that people, groups, governments, no one seems to have the ability anymore to communicate with each other. And that can lead to some pretty scary things.
So. Really addressed a lot of the questions and fears that I have. It gives me more understanding.
Yeah. Well, and this doesn't, the thing about Maslow's whole concept and what we've talked about is it's not going to help us solve any of those problems. It's not. It does help us identify what some of the problems are, things. And it does help us understand why we're feeling those fears and trepidations that we are, because we're not used to that. Especially our generational group, we're not used to that because long ago, we left those behind us in Maslow's hierarchy. We left those behind us and we consider those gone. And now we suddenly say, maybe not. Maybe those aren't as gone as I thought they were. And that's why we have those anxieties and fears, is because that base level that we thought was satisfied is not nearly as solid as we thought it might have been. And yeah, it's scary times. There's no answers here. In this thing, this is just something that helps understand why people do what they do. And the biggest one out here now, the differentiator, is the groupness, group belonging, camaraderie, and the need for positive feedback. So the PLUs get together, whatever their thought process is about whatever it is, whether it's political or sports or whatever, but they get together and they only want to be with people who will positively reinforce their view. And they don't want to hear any opposing views. It's really hard to do with the lions. I'm telling you, it's really, really hard to do to keep that group cohesion up. But I mean, really, that's what I see as the real problem, is that people have started getting into these discrete groups with no communication, and then things go crazy inside those because they're fed by extreme ideas that have no opposing opinion or counterpoint. They're never tamped down. Nobody ever says, wait a minute, are we sure about this? Nobody ever says that. Everybody wants to pile on so they can be recognized as having a voice, so they make it even worse. They start adding rocks to the pile. So, yes, sir.
What do you think a Gen Xer would feel like listening to this? Would they respond? Would they communicate?
Sure. Absolutely, they would, if we could get them in the room to do it. Yeah, no, I don't think any of those people, it's a little harder with the 2020s and things because you can't get them to set their phone down long enough. Honestly, you can't get them to, it would have to shorten this up by 70%. And you'd have to pick one or two slides, and literally pick one or two slides that you really wanted to talk to them about, because they have opinions. You better believe they have opinions about the things. Getting them in the room is the dilemma. They'd listen if you can get them in the room, but getting them in the room and then forcing people in a room doesn't work very well.
Within this on their phones.
Probably not. Probably not. If you had the production capability to produce something that appeals to their psyche, the way they like stuff presented. 2-minute burst, this, that, related to something that happens in their lives. You're only giving them one sentence out of this whole thing. Yeah, you can get them to, and you can put an acorn in there and maybe it'll grow into something, and it's just an inspiring quote kind of a thing to get them to think. And if you could package that in a visual way that, where it could get some traction, yeah, you could do, but you can't do an hour. You can't do an hour talk, for crying out loud. That is not happening. You know that better than anybody. You can't do a 40-minute talk and easily. So, yeah. Anyway, what we have to do at our level is take our chances when we get them with younger people or people that are not, and do things Don't be confrontational. Try to have an inspiring quote or two. And I don't, I hope you realize what I'm saying about that is try to have some kind of a one-liner about a topic that says, oh man, this is a great idea. Think about that. That's it. Don't pound it on them. Don't get in a run and gun battle. Don't, and it may fall on fallow ground. It may not, but that's how I think you deal with younger people is you got to make them do the communication between themselves. And hopefully you can get them an idea. If we in our generation want to reach them, we got to hire them to do the production, do the things. What do you think? What's important? What's hot? Who's the most hottest person in likes something, follows now? You get them to say something. And it can only be a one-liner. Or it can be a song. If you could somehow influence one of the, Taylor Swift, if you could influence her or she somehow had a stunning idea about a social consciousness song, you'd reach millions of people and it would take root and hold. So just like us when we were growing up, how many people can remember the song lyrics from when you were in your teens and 20s to a couple songs? Probably can. You probably remember the lyrics to one or two songs because you heard them 50 times. The same song. And so that's what it takes to get in there. This is all the world according to me, by the way. Don't take this as having any more value than that, because this is all of this is the world according to the spin on this thing is all the world according to me. So anybody else? Oh, Tom.
So it just seems to go and kind of.
And that was the interesting thing because we're the same age roughly, and well, actually he's a kid, but our parents taught us stuff. Not so much anymore, honestly. You talked about that parenting thing and how important it is and all that. A lot of parents, yes. A lot of parents, no. The trouble now is, no matter how bad a parent you are, I'll guarantee you that kid's got a cell phone. I'll guarantee you they have a cell phone. They may not have beans to eat in their family, but that kid's got a cell phone. And that's where they get their information and their things. So their parents are not giving them the song and dance like we had, because I had the same one you had, the same experience with people. My parents been through it and did that, and it rubs off. And parenting rubs off. And that's why the psychologists put that clear at the top, because they want it to be the most important thing. That's why they put that up there, is they want that to be the most important thing. But that requires motivation too. So you don't get to that level of motivation. And once again, unless you got these levels of motivation satisfied, do the thing. So Ron, they're making me run over again.
Thank you very, very much.